We are pleased to welcome our own Dr. Kevin J. Eames, Professor of Psychology, Chair of the Psychology Department, and Director of Institutional Effectiveness as the speaker for our 64th Commencement. Kevin earned a Bachelor of Arts in History from Florida State University, and then both a master's degree in counseling and a PhD in counseling psychology from Georgia State University. After serving as the Chief Learning Officer for ExecuTrain Corporation, he began his academic career at Dordt College in Sioux Center, Iowa in 2001, where he served as Assistant Professor of Psychology and Director of the Graduate Education Program. He moved to Covenant College in 2003 to administer a grant from the Lilly Endowment, then moved into the Psychology Department, where he remains stubbornly ensconced. That's what it says in my script. He loves teaching and encouraging his students to think critically and creatively about the relationship between psychology and Christianity. His scholarly interests include human sexuality and the psychology of religion. His book, The Cognitive Psychology of Religion, was published by Waveland Press in 2016. Kevin and his wife Lisa live in Flintstone, Georgia, and are members of St. Elmo Presbyterian Church, where Kevin serves on the session. They have 3 children: Hillary, class of 2015, age 25, who works as a medical copywriter; Hannah, age 20, who works as a CrossFit trainer; and Daniel, who went to be with the Lord when he was 12. Would you please welcome Professor Kevin Eames?
Thank you. President Halverson, esteemed colleagues, members of the board, families and friends, and most importantly, the class of 2019, I greet you and thank you for this opportunity. Speeches at graduation ceremonies tend to have the distinction of being instantly forgettable, since the real event is each of you walking across stage and getting your diploma, accompanied by applause and the occasional air horn. So before I lose your attention, let me offer you my congratulations. I'm sure you are happy and relieved and are looking forward to a good night's sleep. You have every reason to celebrate, and I am delighted to be able to celebrate with you. I'm deeply honored to be your commencement speaker, and I've been praying about this opportunity since I received the invitation early this semester. I don't want to squander it on graduation cliches, though I might be tempted to mention a few, but I won't. Since this marks a significant passage in your life, it's only natural that you would be looking forward to the future. A popular 80s song echoed this sentiment with the title, "The Future's So Bright, I Have to Wear Shades." And frankly, the music video was a lot better than the song itself. The future we anticipate, however, is in reality an illusory thing, a will-o'-the-wisp that appears as a ghostly light, but keeps receding as we approach. It is reminiscent of the end of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, where Fitzgerald writes that Gatsby believed in the green light, the future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and then one fine morning. Fitzgerald understood how the stories we tell ourselves about the future inspire us to strive toward tomorrow's elusive goal, sacrificing the blessing that is today. Before I continue, I want to apologize to my colleagues in the English department. I've already mentioned F. Scott Fitzgerald without a proper critical analysis, and I must give you fair warning that I will be relying a lot on C.S. Lewis. I have found that C.S. Lewis is a remarkable psychologist who has valuable insights about human nature that are more perceptive than Freud with his Oedipal complex and Skinner with his rats. In Lewis's classic, The Screwtape Letters, there is a chapter devoted to the topic of temporal matters. Screwtape encourages the novice tempter Wormwood to focus the human's mind on the future, to encourage either foolish confidence or oppressive fear, both of which are unfounded because the future is unknown, and it is the least real thing with which we have to contend. A foolish confidence in the future is often the consequence of a sense of privilege that distorts our perception of our own successes. We believe we are the captains of our fate, lulling us into a complacency that tempts us to neglect our daily dependence on the Lord who gives us our daily bread. Our gratitude for our daily blessings is perfunctory, unlike our brothers and sisters in other places whose daily bread comes unpredictably. Their gratitude is heartfelt. Because of our confidence, we tend to devote little attention to the spiritual battles that are fought in our midst, forgetting that our adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. In spite of our espoused faith, the secular age in which we live tempts us to combine foolish confidence with fragilized belief. Such confidence is no different from the foolish man who builds his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. This can happen when the illusory confidence we place in tomorrow that we've mistaken for our faith shipwrecks on the rocks of serious illness, an untimely death, or chronic, relentless disappointment. This foolish confidence is very different from the future and hope that God promises to Judah in Jeremiah 29:11. This was God's promise to the exiles in Babylon and looks forward to their return to their land. There is a difference between the words of God's prophet and the future we imagine in our mind. Fearing the future is like being afraid of monsters in your closet. You can imagine all kinds of terrifying scenarios that keep you awake, waiting for something hairy and fangy to get you. But in the end, the fears you've conjured dissipate with the morning, leaving you only with a rotten night's sleep. Our fears may be limited to our own future, where we wonder whether we'll find a spouse or a successful career, or they broaden to encompass things like the economy or terrorism. So often, not always, but often the objects of our fears reside in our imagination and nowhere else. Living angst-ridden and haunted by the future can compel us to take matters into our own hands, ready to break God's commands in the present if by doing so we can bring about some utopian goal or avert some dystopian disaster. The danger is that we give the future our hearts and place our treasures there. We can be perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, forgetting to be honest, kind, or contented now. The gifts we are given in the present we use to fuel the heap of the altar of the future. Lewis makes an important distinction between the future and eternity. While our lives are moving inevitably and inescapably toward eternity, the future exists only in our minds, and ultimately what happens may or may not resemble what we had imagined. Our lives, as many of you know, can change in an instant. It's not the future, but eternity that God has set in our hearts, as the author of Ecclesiastes 3 tells us. And it is for eternity that we are destined. By contrast, Lewis writes that the future is the least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time. For the past, he writes, is frozen and no longer flows, and the present is all lit up with eternal rays. Lewis contends that God wants us to attend to two things: eternity itself and the present, either meditating on our eternal union with or separation from himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. This emphasis impresses upon us the sanctity of the present moment. Now, for the conscientious among you, you may be concerned that such an emphasis on the present, with its lack of proper planning, apparently for the future, is too reminiscent of the ant and the grasshopper in Aesop's fable. Lewis suggests that God wants us to think of the future so much as is necessary for today, planning the acts of justice or charity that will probably be our duty tomorrow. The duty of planning tomorrow's work is today's duty. Though its material is borrowed from the present, the duty, like all duties, is in the present. Now, when I was 5 years old, this shouldn't surprise you, I was adorable. But I was also diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. When I was 15, and frankly much less adorable, a newspaper reporter did an interview with me about being a diabetic. Her story began with the following line. At 15 years old, Kevin Eames has already lived over half his life. Now, fortunately, as you can see, this reporter was terrible at prognosticating. I am 58 now, well past the 30-year mark that she predicted. And at 15, I didn't really have the maturity to navigate this existential crisis. I didn't even know I was supposed to have an existential crisis. Besides, my doctor at the time used very colorful language to describe what was wrong with the article, that it was a piece of sensationalism. Imagine, though, how you would change if you were told that you had a limited amount of time to live. How would it change your values and your priorities? Suddenly, both the present and eternity would come sharply into focus. Suddenly, you become profoundly aware of the sanctity of the present moment. A Pharisee asked Jesus what was the greatest commandment in the law. Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Love of God and our neighbor occur in the present. It is where we encounter no ordinary people, no mere mortals. As Lewis writes in The Weight of Glory, it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. It is a serious thing to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in your nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. By living in the present, we realize our behavior is less about the future and more about living in the light of eternity. Our daily interactions in the drive-thru and with baristas take on greater significance when we realize they are immortal beings. As such, each encounter is an opportunity to demonstrate the love of Christ, to seek their welfare first, to forget our own need to be heard or seen. In fact, our lives consist of the accumulation of the individual decisions we make on a moment-by-moment basis. It's those decisions upon which the direction of our lives often turn, and so they require as much sanctified attention as we give to our future plans. Now, it may be easy to live in the present when we're healthy, prosperous, and fulfilled in our relationships, but how do we remain faithful when the present moment is filled with uncertainty or pain? We echo David, who cried, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Such times of trial will come upon all of us, not once, but often in our lives. This should come as no surprise. When we find ourselves surprised by suffering, we suffer twice. In a first world culture where we encounter so little hardship or deprivation, we are tempted to see such pains as aberrations, even as psychological disorders requiring diagnosis and treatment. Yet we are fallen people living in a fallen world, and our finitude and sinfulness manifest themselves in suffering. It is during such times that the 17th century theologian Jean-Pierre de Caussade calls us to abandon ourselves to the will of God. He tells us to find contentment in the present moment, to adore the divine will in the midst of all things we must do, and even in what we must suffer. It may be during such times of suffering that we feel God has removed himself from us. Returning to the screw tape letters, the human in the book experiences a crisis of faith, but remains faithful. So Screw Tape writes, "Be not deceived, wormwood. We are never more in jeopardy than when a human no longer desiring but still intending to do God's will looks around upon a universe in which every trace of him seems to have vanished and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys." This is the same conclusion that David came to at the end of Psalm 13, when he writes, "But I have trusted your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." So, at this transitional moment in your life, as you look ahead, you will see two very different things. Usually, the things we see in the near distance are clearer than the things that are further away, but not today. The future you think you see is actually mist and fog. Eternity, however, seems to be on the distant horizon, but is in fact right before you, illuminating all that you do in the present day. It is the present day where we are called to love one another, build up one another, accept one another, bear one another's burdens, and show kindness to one another. When you think about your life, what should bring you the greatest satisfaction is not the number of Instagram followers that you have or the material possessions you've accumulated, but the people that you've authentically loved and the relationships in which you have invested and those who have invested in you. As you leave the auditorium today, remember that those that you encounter are all immortal, eternal creatures with whom you will either share everlasting splendor or who will be separated forever from the one for whom they were made. Remember that this moment, this very moment, with its applause, elation, and air horns, is radiant with the light of eternity. Amen.